So the strategy that I'm presenting on today is language framework planning. So what language framework planning is it identifies the language necessary for students to be successful in a lesson. The teacher is going to plan activities that support the use of the language in multiple functions. And finally, the teacher creates a framework prior to the lesson that identifies the topic, activities, language functions, language structures, and vocabulary. This part down here is kind of the essence of what the language framework planning is. It's getting yourself a nice little chart planned out in front of you where you identify what might be difficult for your students so you can kind of plan ahead in teaching them it. So what you want to do first is you want to identify language objectives. So you want to identify the language objectives to be taught and how they relate to the language functions. You want to create a language function checklist to inform instructions if that helps. You then want to identify and model the problematic structures. So you want to identify which structures, which parts of the lesson might be difficult and likely to give students problems. Then you want to plan the instructional sequence. So that's just as it sounds, it's basically creating the lesson. It's writing down what you want to do, what you want to teach, and how you want to achieve it. You want to assess and document student progress. So you want to plan a way to make sure that your students are being successful and that they're keeping up with the information that you're teaching. And finally, add technology if you can. It's not necessary. Don't force the use of technology if it's not needed, but it's really helpful if you have the opportunity and the resources. So now we're going to move on to the actual lesson portion of this. So this is an actual framework chart that I made for a lesson on the Bill of Rights. As you can see, I have the topics, activities, language functions, language structures, and the vocabulary. The topics are history, research, oral report. Then they have activities there'll be a lecture. Students will examine an amendment in depth, and they will present their research. Then have examples of some of the language functions that might be difficult for students, such as comparing, describing, following directions, planning, and explaining and summarizing. Then have the different structures, what sentences and things in the directions or in the lesson might be difficult for the students to understand or just need to be said in different ways. What is an example? How is this? Ways to get students thinking. And then finally, the vocabulary that is difficult or might be difficult for each section. So now I'm going to move on to the lesson. Students have a copy of their directions to an assignment that I gave, which gives directions on a presentation on a certain amendment from the Bill of Rights. So we're going to start with the history. As you remember from the chart, the history is the first step. It's a brief lecture. So I would then teach the students a little bit about each amendment, not going in too deep. I have I have 5 here and the other 5 in the next slide. So it's the freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, restricts quartering of soldiers, it's the right against unlawful search and seizures, right against double jeopardy and self-incrimination. And then for the next 5, we have the right to a fair trial, the right to a trial by jury, right against excessive bail. There are rights not mentioned in the Constitution, and there is a separation of power. Students will be taking notes during this part and picking out what they think is important. After that, we move on to the second part of the language matrix planning, which is the research portion. That's the project portion for the students, where they will research a fact about a certain amendment. They'll get in their class groups and spend some time digging into a particular amendment, why it was needed, why the Founding Fathers felt it was important, and an example of how this right looks today. That'll be a way to get them thinking about the different amendments more in depth and why they're important to our history. And then finally, we have the oral report, which was the final portion of my chart. The oral report will be where the students will present their research. It's where they do things like synthesize their ideas and discuss what they learned and what they found important. That's kind of the method you would use to utilize a language chart. Kind of presents the ideas that might be difficult, how you would use them, and how you can successfully implement them. It's a way of planning the lesson before you start and being able to direct your thinking to help your students have a better experience.